I don't think Trump knows anything about this conflict. I mean, he couldn't tell you what piece of territory is under whose control. He doesn't care
which
about
country
Donbass.
Kursk is in.
He doesn't know where Kursk is. He probably thinks it's somewhere in Nebraska, and it's ruled by a communist cadre led by Tim Walz. Whatever. Like, this is not somebody I want to barter with the fate of nations.
We are back with Michael Weiss, editor of The Insider, which is a Russia-focused independent media outlet. He's also the host of the Foreign Office podcast, former investigative reporter for CNN. He's got an upcoming book about the GRU next year, 2026. We don't know, but it's going to be good. How you doing, Michael?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Tim.
Hey, man, thanks for coming by. I monitor your stuff closely, and I've felt extremely remiss since, I don't know, just picking a date out of the hat, June 27th, at my efforts on this podcast to cover things other than the 2024 political or presidential campaign. And with all that's been going on in Ukraine, I thought the folks would appreciate an update. So biggest picture, talk to me like I just haven't been reading your media outlet. Like, what, Ukraine has made an incursion into Russia. Like, what is the latest state of play on the ground?
Yeah, so against all expectations and by complete surprise, Ukraine launched this midsummer offensive, not to take or retake territory in its own sovereign borders, but to essentially create a buffer zone, as President Zelensky has now described it, in southern Russia in the region of Kursk. And initially, this looked to be another cross-border raid of the kind that we've seen innumerable times in the last 18 months. Usually what the Ukrainians have done is they've recruited a group of Russian fighters, proxies, flying under the mantle of an independent, free, anti-Putin Russia. And they just do PR ops, right? They go across the border, they shoot some stuff up, they take selfies with their flags, and they go home. And so it looked like this could be the start of another one of those. And it's true, they use those proxies as kind of the vanguard or the tip of the spear for this incursion. But this has turned out to be a major operation with as many as 4, perhaps not full, Ukrainian brigades committed to it, including 2 very elite units, the airborne assault units. And this shows no indications of them packing up and going home. Quite the opposite. It looks like they're fortifying their lines, digging in. I've seen evidence of excavators, so presumably they're going to start to build trenches, the way the Russians are now doing farther back along the line to keep the Ukrainians from advancing farther. Best estimate that I've seen from very clever map makers and military analysts is that the Ukrainians are now in control of something like 1,200 square kilometers of territory, which, if this is true, means that they have retaken in the space of 2 weeks more, or captured, I should say, because not retaken. They didn't have this to begin with. They've captured in the space of 2 weeks more territory than Russia has been able to capture in Ukraine in the space of 8 months to a year. So that's pretty significant accomplishment. Now, there are pitfalls or hazards ahead, namely, well, what happens when the Russians really come in and try to boot them out? A lot of people thought this would have happened already. Some of the stuff we're tracking at The Insider suggests that the level of discombobulation and utter chaos and incompetence on the Russian side is, it sort of beggars belief, even for those of us who go in assuming there's going to be levels of discombobulation, incompetence, and chaos.
Low expectations are not even being met at the Russian military competence.
Funnily enough, we published yesterday an intercepted conversation with a municipal official in Kursk who just kind of lambastes everybody at all levels, the regional government, the military. He said they're sending in conscripts, these unwashed 18-year-olds who had 2 magazines apiece, never seen combat before, and instead of protecting the civilians had to evacuate the troops when they were being pulled back. He said wherever we would turn up, the next village over, the Ukrainians were already there. That's how quick, that's how much of a lightning advance this was. There's still a lot of fog of war here, and there's still a lot I can't speak with any authority about.
It's like, is Ukraine holding the territory that they have
so far they are. Yeah. I mean,
right. No, I know that, but like, so as they keep moving forward, they're keeping some of the units back, and that is like,
yeah. I mean, it's sort of extraordinary. CNN had one of their correspondents actually in bed with the Ukrainians as they seamlessly just rolled across the border from Sumy, which is the Ukrainian oblast to the south of Kursk, right into Kursk. It's the first time CNN's embedded with Ukraine going into Russia, right? Which is a deep humiliation for Putin. Now, to what extent he gives a shit, I don't know. It seems that he's sort of shrugging about this, right? Really, they kind of see it as no big deal. It's couched now, their attempt to recapture their territory as an anti-terrorist operation. And that's for very specific reasons, because if they were to declare all-out war against Ukraine, which, by the way, up until this point, 2.5 years into a war, they still have not done, that calls in sort of strategic doctrine, which means possible use of nuclear weapons and all the rest of it. So if it's an anti-terror operation, that means it's ceded to our old friends in the FSB, who, speaking of discombobulation, incompetence, and corruption, that is possibly very good news for the Ukrainian side, because they have managed to get the better of that service time and time again. So look, how this thing ends, I have no idea. I don't think anybody does. I've seen a lot of people get ahead of their skis on this, saying this is going to be a calamity, this is going to backfire. Why are they doing this? They're taking badly needed resources from the Eastern Front in Donbass, particularly in the Pokrovsk direction, where the Russians are advancing steadily and have been for several months. However, there's the alternate theory here, which is, and certainly the Ukrainians have conveyed this to us when we've interviewed them, they are hopeful that the Russians will begin to deploy some of their critical resources from other points along the contact line into Kursk, because, again, they simply cannot sustain or withstand this using 18-year-old conscripts who basically were assured they're going to get to sit out the war and just do their mandatory military service. Right now, in fact, they're going to have to enter into a hot war zone where, I should add, the Ukrainians are using American, British, Lithuanian, Polish, German armor. They are using HIMARS, and the rockets provided with the HIMARS, the Gimlers. They're not using ATACMS because we won't let them do that in Russian territory. And they're using a swarm of first-person view drones, which have become a really lethal, modernized piece of hardware on the battlefield. I mean, these things, you can actually see as they chase Russian soldiers, and then suddenly the camera goes dark because they've impacted. I mean, Russians are terrified of these FPVs. To some extent, they've actually been committing suicide before allowing an FPV to strike them, because it's a horrible way to die. So, yeah, I mean, they're in it to win it, it seems.
So the Ukrainian, so then their theory of the case here is that this is not just an effort to humiliate Putin, right? That it's a strategic move to hopefully force Russia to change their, where they're distributing their forces, et cetera.
I think it's a combination of things. Number one, there is a PR or a propaganda element involved in this. Sure. We're talking about Ukraine invading Russia, right? That alone, unfathomable in January of 2022, or even in March of 2022 when they started to push the Russians out of Kyiv. So this is a deep humiliation. They're exploiting it for all it's worth. They're showing footage of, they've got Ukrainian correspondents in Kursk interviewing civilians who say, oh, the Ukrainians are treating us great. They tell us, go about your business and we're here to protect you. And, welcome to the People's Republic of Kursk and all this kind of thing. So they've flipped the script incredibly well. It's a much needed shot in the arm, too, for Ukrainian morale. So one of the problems that they've been facing in terms of manpower in the last year, especially since their failed summer counteroffensive of last summer, is a lot of people don't want to fight because they saw this as kind of a wasted effort. Why am I going to go sit in a trench, get killed, and then my comrades can't even take my corpse from the battlefield because there's not enough suppressive fire, right? There was a shortfall of ammunition. They were running out of, their drones were being hit with electronic warfare from the Russian side. So for the first time in the war, we began to see it flagging morale on the Ukrainian side. Well, this operation, which, by the way, is also fielding freshly mobilized Ukrainian troops who've been trained and sent into battle for the first time inside Russia and are now doing incredibly well there. This is going to bolster, and I think there's some indications that it already has bolstered morale on the Ukrainian side. There's this other argument that, hey, territory for territory. If Donald Trump should be elected in November and there's pressure put on Kyiv to do some kind of deal that they don't want to do, they'd much rather do it from an advantageous position of saying, we'll give you back a slice of sovereign Russia if you give us back a slice of sovereign Ukraine. I mentioned the redeployment of resources, hoping that they're going to stretch Russian lines and supply lines, logistics, and all the rest of it. There's that. Right now, we're looking at a situation where Ukraine has destroyed 3 bridges across a river in Kursk, and the Russians have 1 pontoon bridge left. If they lose that bridge, they have no way of rescuing something like 700 of their troops who will be in a pocket, basically, trapped. So this is another thing the Ukrainians have said. They are capturing POW after POW, upwards of 1,000 as of now. Imagine they get those 700 guys, 1,700 Russian POWs. Those are good assets to be traded for Ukrainian POWs. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is kind of there's a series of arguments to be made, I think, of different motivating factors behind this. But so far it's working. The question is, how long will it work? And, if the Ukrainians are eventually pushed out, what are they going to lose in terms of kit and manpower, et cetera? But it's also interesting, too, I think, this fear of escalation, which has been kind of a predominant theme of this conflict since even before the actual invasion in February of 2022. I think anybody who's arguing fear of escalation at this point really needs to have their head examined. I mean, as I mentioned,
well, this was going to be my next question. We're still holding them back, right? I guess there was news last week or maybe over the weekend that Ukraine wanted to use some British weapons to fire into Russia, and we're blocking them from that. Like, what's the story with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the American government, the Biden administration, I should say, does not want to see American missiles impacting Russian strategic air bases inside Russian territory, right? They don't want to see missiles being used against Russian military installations inside Russia. I understand that. I understand it from a political level. I understand it from, the level of, well, hey, this is still a nuclear power. We don't want to upset them unduly. But you have to proceed from evidence, right? Not from sort of grand IR theory, much of which I have to say, I give a lot of credit to the Ukrainians, not just for besting supposedly the greatest army in Europe and humiliating them again and again. I give them credit for debunking a lot of received wisdom and myths that have been built up since during the Cold War, but certainly that have obtained beyond the Cold War into the post-Soviet era. If you punch the Russians in the face and you bloody their nose, it does not lead to World War III. I mean, I started noticing this in August of 2022, the first summer of the full-scale invasion. The Ukrainians somehow destroyed upwards of 50% of the Black Sea Fleet's naval aviation group with some strike on Saki Air Base. There's footage of this where you have a bunch of Russian beachgoers, all of a sudden this plume of smoke behind them, and they're all run scattering. Before this attack, Dmitry Medvedev, who was the former president of Russia, now he's the deputy chairman of their National Security Council, alcoholic
tweeter,
good drunk
tweeter.
Yeah, good drunk tweeter. He had put up on Telegram some rant saying that if the Ukrainians think of doing anything to Crimea, it'll be Armageddon. Saki Air Base goes boom. The Russian government official response was, it was a smoking accident. Somebody lit up a cig next to a oil tanker, and that's what happened. It's the only thing they've denied the Ukrainians have done, by the way, which is interesting. What did Medvedev do? He deleted his Telegram post, right? There's a critical piece of data right there. They talk a big game of threatening to reduce the West to radioactive ash, and they're going to, invade NATO countries, and tanks will roll into Berlin. Well, no, actually, German tanks are rolling into Russia right now. And the response is, well, it's a counterterrorism operation. We'll get it sorted in due course, but we have other things to worry about. Okay, so you've shown your cards. You really can take it. And it's not going to be the end of the world. And I think we need to sort of alter our perception of security assistance and act accordingly. I mean, yeah, absolutely, they should be allowed to use Storm Shadow against Russian planes sitting on the tarmac, planes that, should they take off, are going to do what? They're going to rain fire on Ukrainian cities and kill loads of civilians. I mean, we would not fight a war this way with one hand tied behind our back. If the U.S. government position, which I think is very good and moral, is, well, it's fine for Ukraine to invade Russia. This is part of their defense. They're the victim here. Russia's the aggressor. Sure. You have to take the fight to the aggressor on its own soil. Well, then it stands to reason they should be allowed to do that with the full panoply of kit they've been provided. And again, I fail to see the distinction. Putin and his regime couch this as they're not fighting Ukraine. And they do this for very understandable psychological reasons. They consider the Ukrainians to be inferior. They're almost a subspecies. They're not real people. They don't really have a culture and a nation. There's nothing there. They're just Russians who haven't realized it yet.
Right.
So they say we're fighting NATO. Okay. So then if you're fighting NATO already, it doesn't matter if a storm shadow slams into, one of your airfields, right? Because you've been doing this for 2.5 years. So I think we have to kind of learn how to call the bluff a little bit better.
Okay, so let's just set aside the dystopia of Donald Trump winning and what an endgame might look like there, and think instead of the current trajectory we're on. Let's say that Harris wins re-election. I'm curious, first, like your thoughts about, okay, that would obviously be a key inflection point. Clearly, the Russians are waiting and hoping for their man in Mar-a-Lago. So how might that change? What's the balance of power? How would that look then? And then after that, I want to talk a little bit more about Kamala's foreign policy, but just in the Ukraine, Russia side of things, like what do you think would be a potential step to endgame if Kamala is elected?
Well, okay, let me just start by saying when Biden was still in the race and it looked like this was going to be a walk for Trump back into the White House, the most optimistic appraisal I heard from the Ukrainian side, but also from, I think, understandably traumatized and let's put some lipstick on a pig type, analysts in the West, including in the United States, including from Democrats, by the way, who were very worried about where this was headed, is, well, yeah, he'll try to do a deal, but then, Putin will rat fuck him, as Putin always does, and then Trump will get upset and he'll just give all the weapons except nukes to the Ukrainians. I found this to be very, very naively optimistic about Trump. I don't think Trump knows anything about this conflict. I mean, he couldn't tell you what piece of territory is under whose control. He doesn't care
which
about
country
Donbass.
Kursk is in.
He doesn't know where Kursk is. He probably thinks it's somewhere in Nebraska and it's ruled by, a communist cadre led by Tim Walz. Whatever. Like, this is not somebody I want to barter with the fate of nations and a lot of people who are living under occupation, which, if you know what's happening in the occupied territories of Ukraine, is barbaric. Women and children are being tortured and raped. Children are being disappeared and stolen and brought into Russia to be essentially auctioned off as orphans to adoptive parents, told that their parents don't exist in Ukraine. I mean, it's really horrific. This is not somebody I want trying to sort this out. Now, the question you ask is, if it's Kamala Harris, how do things? I think it's mostly going to be a continuation of the Biden administration policy. Her national security advisor, or I forget the term of art that's used if you're vice president. Phil Gordon. Yeah. So Phil Gordon, I have mixed feelings about, because I remember quite well his view on Syria, which I spent 10 years covering. And the book I wrote on ISIS I'd really set out to write a book about the Syrian revolution and that civil war. And it became a book about jihad, because unfortunately this conflict evolved into a jihadist.
He was dovish on Syria, right? Dovish.
Well, more than dovish. I mean, he basically thought we shouldn't do anything. Yeah. He thought Obama even articulating the so-called red line on chemical weapons was folly. He then gave an interview with Jeff Goldberg in The Atlantic saying, well, if you're going to make a red line and it gets violated, you have to uphold it. So he said we should have done those strikes, whatever. He didn't want to help Syrian rebels.
That's a fair point. That's okay.
Yeah, no, that is a fair point.
We should have either done it or not. Shat or get off the pot. That's not that bad of a...
But my bigger point is, if it were up to Phil Gordon, they wouldn't have even made that sort of criterion for intervention. So anyway, on the Middle East, he's anti-intervention. He wrote a book about the folly of regimes. I mean, I wrote a book. My ISIS book is as much about the catastrophe of Iraq and what led to AQI's, essentially it's the advent of AQI, and so much unpleasantness from there. But Syria was always different because it was bottom up and there was a genuine groundswell. Anyway, I don't want to relitigate this, but I will say in Phil Gordon's defense, what's interesting is he was one of the first Democratic policymakers, advisor types who, I think in 2018, co-wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs where he called for sending higher grade military equipment to Ukraine, including, I think, armored personnel carriers and other things. It was kind of an interesting... So Phil Gordon, he's a Francophile. He's a West European guy. Yeah. And that's kind of his bailiwick. And insofar as now, I think the major crisis that any president is going to inherit is still in Europe. This is not altogether a bad thing. And I think he would be perhaps even more forward-leaning on Ukraine than some elements within the Biden administration. The Biden administration is not monolithic, by the way.
Yeah.
You can do a Kremlinology of who is terrified of
nuclear war versus
nuclear.
Who wants
well, we should all be terrified of nuclear war, but I mean, like, who thinks an ATACMS hit inside Russia will lead to World War III versus who thinks essentially what I was saying, which is no. I mean, they can take it, and they've shown that they can take it. Yeah. But I it remains to be seen. I always query. We have this Estonian military analyst called Carl. I can't say who he is because he chooses to remain anonymous, and he's developed a mystique even within Estonia, such that the prime minister wants to know where is Carl and what does he think. But anyway,
so you can tell us that it's not Thomas Ilves's.
It's not Thomas Ilves.
He doesn't have a secret alternate named Carl.
If you follow Thomas on Twitter, you know that he is uncorked and does not need any kind of veil of anonymity whatsoever. But no, Carl seems to think actually that Kamala Harris, shall we say, will be unburdened by all that has been with respect to Ukraine, and might actually be, there'll be fresh blood in the administration, people who will say, come on, let's take the gloves off a little bit. Let's hit the Russians where it hurt. I don't know. Maybe
and the Ukrainians, so I guess my last question on that is, okay, let's dream with me for a second. Let's say that's true, right? Yeah. Like what is the Ukrainian pitch for how to get this to, some kind of closure, right? Like even if you gave them everything they wanted, like then what?
Okay, well, the brochure answer in Ukraine is all 1991 borders.
Yeah.
I was there in January of 2022 with a simple journalistic ask of myself. Why is it that nobody in this country is panicking and everybody elsewhere is saying war is imminent?
Yeah.
And the answer I got was, well, Russia, they're not that crazy. They know that if they invade us full scale, we'll bleed them to death. Well, they turned out to be right about that. So they were wrong about the war happening, but for the right reason. Yeah. But the other thing that they would say kind of sotto voce is, listen, between you and me, Michael, the Russians sort of did us a favor in 2014 by invading and taking over the two parts of our country that are the most predominant with ethnic Russians and people who tend to lean toward Moscow more rather than toward the West. So in other words, Putin kind of pent up all the fifth columnists such that it allowed a decade for Ukraine to politically kind of develop this level of cohesion and integration, which is one of the reasons that I think they're going to be within the European Union much sooner than they will be in NATO. Now, that's not to say that they don't want their terrain back.
Sure.
Donbass they see as this sort of blighted black hole. It's complete. Most of the cities and towns and settlements are in utter ruins. It's a pocked moonscape. There's no infrastructure there. To rebuild will take years, if not decades. And they sort of acknowledge, this should not be our priority. We don't want the Russians to take more of our territory, but recapturing Donbass and then also creeping up that much closer to the Russian border so that they'll constantly reinvade us, maybe that's not in the offing. Crimea, however, they see as a big, viable, juicy target. And even before the summer counteroffensive, I was hearing, look south, young man, because that's where we're going. And that's indeed, the main axis was to sever the line of communication between mainland Russia and Crimea, chip away at Russian positions and logistics in Kherson, Zaporizhia region, and then ultimately with the aim of recapturing Crimea. And if you notice, and unfortunately this has not got as much news attention as it deserved in the last year. It's been eclipsed by a lot of dooming and pessimism about Ukraine's prospects. In the last year, Ukraine has done something kind of extraordinary. They have all but neutralized the Black Sea Fleet, most of which has now repaired to Novorossiysk in Russia, to another port in mainland Russia. So they're out of Sevastopol. They have been destroying systematically, using, by the way, ATACMS and Storm Shadows and their own homebrewed fleet of seaborne drones and aerial drones, advanced Russian air defense systems like the S-300, the S-400 platform in Crimea. They've been conducting these sort of stealth raids in Crimea. These are shaping exercises for what I think will be the next big battle or the next big play, which is let's recapture the peninsula, which strategically, economically for them is much more valuable than parts of Donetsk and Lugansk.
Got it.
Now, they're not going to say that publicly, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of flack for saying it publicly.
Yeah.
But it's sort of kind of the not so secret goal, I think.
Cool.
Or at least it was. Maybe it's changed now that they have cursed. Maybe they want to take Moscow next.
All right, now we're talking.
Now
Welcome to the Neocon Podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
We're marching on Moscow. All right, Michael Weiss. Hopefully, we'll be in the Coconut Grove come winter, and I can have you back more, and we can nerd out more rather than having to care so much about the Alanis Morissette videos that Donald Trump is bleeding on his social media feed. And I'm
just waiting for Ryan Reynolds to come out and tweet that that version of the song is not about him either.
It's not about him either. No, it was not me. Me and Alanis never had a thing. I was great to her. All right, Michael Weiss, thank you so much. Come back soon.
Yep.
Everybody go check out The Insider if you want to nerd out on what is happening in Russia. We'll be back tomorrow with convention coverage, review of the Biden speech, and the dreamiest man in Democratic politics. We'll see you all then. Peace.